Jürgen Klöckner, you are with Politico. Not everybody knows Politico, although many do. What is Politico?
Well, Politico is a news outlet. We were founded 20 years ago in the US, and 1 year ago we had our start here in Germany.
And that was quite a start, right?
It was quite a start, but I would leave that to the audience to judge that. But if you haven't read it, I give you a strong advice to subscribe to every newsletter we have, especially Berlin Playbook, our freshly released industrial policy and trade newsletter, by the way.
Yeah. And Jürgen, why do you like working at Politico?
Because it's international. I have so many international colleagues, that's fantastic, and we share so much expertise across newsrooms. We have a huge newsroom in Brussels, a huge newsroom in London, Paris, but also in DC, and especially the topics we're talking about today, it's very useful to have so much expertise across the globe.
And what do you expect to get out of this panel?
Well, I think we are witnessing a key moment now in the trade negotiations between the US and the EU, and I talked to a lot of policymakers recently from Berlin and Brussels, and I always heard a slight notion of fear that this trade talks will go in a terrible direction, and so probably we will get some optimistic note today from that panel.
Great. Well, thank you so much for doing it and to brave such a big panel. And with this, I hand it over into your trustful hands.
Thank you. And you take a seat, right?
Yeah.
So please give a warm welcome to my 6 panelists, which I'm really happy that you join us today. Christian Vorwig, he is Director General for External Economic Policy from the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Happy you join us.
Well,
yes. Daniel Malnay, he is non-resident Senior Fellow from the Atlantic Council. Happy you join us. Welcome, Dan.
Where would you like me? Yeah?
Take a seat, yes. Brian Lanzer, he's partner at the Mercury Public Affairs. Hello, Brian. And we have Roy Hausman, Legislative Director from the United Steelworkers. Hello, Roy. So, Christian, I would like to start with you.
Sure.
You have quite a history of trade talks, right? You have been at the heart of trade talks for years. And the Chancellor yesterday talked about the negotiations in his speech in the Bundestag, and he was quite optimistic that we will have a solution in July. Do you share that optimism?
Well, I'm quite optimistic too. I share these expectations because what I saw in the last days, there are very intense negotiations going on in all areas. We visited Washington last week. We had the 3rd meeting with Ambassador Greer. We met Secretary Lagnick, Secretary Bessant, and my impression from these talks is it's going in the right direction, I would say. We see a lot of turbulences still, and I'm not sure about the deadline of the 9th of July, whatever comes out, but I'm quite sure we're moving in the right direction. We will see some result there.
What Berlin has to offer, or what did you offer actually in your talks?
Berlin has nothing to offer. It's the EU that has something to offer.
Of course, but you have some interest, right?
No, but Berlin, of course, is Germany is part of the EU, and there is certainly an EU offer. What do we have to offer that on our side is well, a lot of closer cooperation. We have to offer something in the energy field. We have to, if we talk about economic security, if we talk about our common challenges, we have, let's say, overcapacities from certain Asian countries, from non-market economies. There's a lot we can talk about. Critical minerals to mention, even about recycling we talked. So there is a lot of issues where we can work together, and we have seen this well also from the side of our American counterparts.
There are rumors, a lot of papers going on and forth between the Brussels, Berlin, DC. Have you seen any of that papers? Can you share any of that papers with us?
Not seen any of these papers. No, but of course you're right. A lot of papers going on.
So you haven't seen them, right?
Well, I know the contents of the papers. Yeah, that's my job, of course. But would be the wrong place to comment on everything what's in the papers. Yeah.
Then you have seen the view from the other side of the table, right? From the US side, as US chief negotiator for both the EU and UK. So how do you think this will end? Is that headed towards escalation, or do you share optimism towards a compromise?
I think, on balance, I share optimism. I think there is a clear path forward because, behind all the tariffs and all the disruption are, I think, some common challenges that we, U.S., Germany, and the EU face with respect to non-market economy policies and practices, challenges of supply chain resilience, challenges of non-tariff barriers. And I think right now there's a sense of urgency to find solutions to these problems, which haven't fully been addressed by the current multilateral system. I think you need to have some discussions between the parties to figure out how we address these new challenges. And everything that I've seen suggests that the parties are seriously looking down and looking at the underlying causes for the disruption that we face now and trying to address the underlying causes rather than sort of the superficial disruptions. So on the whole, I think there's a positive path forward, and signs are that the parties are doing a very good job with a very super strong team on the German side and on the U.S. side. It looks like they're focusing in the right direction.
Before we go ahead, I made a terrible mistake. I forgot to introduce our one panelist, Vilas Pathy-Kondor, who's joining us virtually from DC in a very unkind hour, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So please
That's
give
right, but it's okay.
So please
Very
give
happy to be here.
Okay. Please give a very, very, very warm applause to Vilas. He's economic advisor in the U.S. International Trade Commission. Thank you that you're joining us. And I can hand the next question right over to you, Vilas. You advise from inside the system, right? What is the long view from the ITC? How are blanket tariffs shaping or shaking American competitive and innovation?
Well, thank you for the question, and thanks for the invite to the panel. Before I get to the question, I just want to mention that these are my personal views today and not those of the ITC overall, its commissioners, or certainly not the Trump administration. In terms of the tariffs, it's certainly a new development that we're working through. The ITC provides analysis to the President and Congress. We adjudicate trade disputes, and we are not policymakers here at the ITC. So we are reacting to the news coming from the administration, just like everyone else, and making ourselves available to the administration to the extent it requires further analysis. So that's sort of our position in the landscape. I can't speak too much for the administration, and we'll leave it at that.
So, Vilas, let me ask you, are you personally optimistic?
Well, certainly there's active discussions underway, hearing quite a bit of news about that. It's difficult for someone in my position to express a perspective either way on where things will go, but certainly being in the room and discussing the issues that the two sides face. I agree that non-market economies and focusing on issues related to China are particularly important to this administration. They've made no secret about it. And to the extent that those issues can be discussed, that would be very helpful.
Brian, do you share that? And I would like to understand would be an optimistic outcome of that negotiations for you, because the German Chancellor, is expecting free trade as probably the best outcome of that. Christian, you can contradict if you see it differently, right. But what would be, in your opinion, a good outcome of that negotiations?
First of all, I'm very optimistic. What I've learned over the years and what I've learned being close to President Trump is that where challenges exist, opportunities always exist as well. That's always his mindset. His mindset is, it's not a politician mindset, it's a business mindset. A businessman's mindset is to look at a problem and come up with a solution. And there's clearly been a problem with the trade relationship that at least President Trump feels. There's been a problem with the trade relationship with Europe. There's been a problem with trade relationships all over the world. And it's been imbalanced towards the United States. I don't think you can point to probably 3 dozen cities as a result of these trade policies that have been bankrupted because employers have been laid off, people have moved, and that's not good for the United States. So what I'm optimistic about this is I'm optimistic in the sense that we're going to have a president who, whatever deals he negotiates, it's actually going to be to the benefit of the United States. We're not going to see a flight of American workers lose their jobs because manufacturing jobs are moving overseas. This president has made it a priority to try to re-industrialize the United States. Tariff policy is one tool he can use. It's probably, and as disruptive as it feels, it's probably the safest one. The other one is export controls, and that's not as fun to experience because that's harder to get out of. So I'm optimistic that we're having this tariff conversation. I'm optimistic because there's an urgency, and I'm optimistic for the first time that I feel the United States is being heard. At least President Trump feels the United States is being heard with their concerns, because for a long time they've been ignored. And this president, it's been many presidents who've had these same concerns. The difference is this president is a businessman, and what businessmen do is they go to a conflict and they seek solutions. What politicians do is they kick the can down the road when there's a difficult problem.
Brian, before I get the perspective from the union perspective on the labor question, I would like to hear from you. What do you think is beneficial for U.S. workers, high tariffs or no tariffs?
Listen, I think what's better for U.S. workers are jobs. And that's what matters more. It doesn't matter whether high tariffs or low tariffs. What matters is that American jobs are not being lost as a result of this trade regime that exists. And I appreciate the unions. I mean, the best thing the unions have learned more than anything else, and they'll tell you the reason they get results is because conflict. Conflict is what creates the urgency, and it's what creates the results. And that is the gift that the unions have understood better than anybody else, is that in order for them to achieve their goals, they need to have conflict. And what we have now is we have conflict, and now we have an urgency. And that hasn't happened before. President Trump hasn't felt that urgency, at least we haven't felt it, and now as a result of the conflict that's created, we're feeling that urgency. So the model that we're seeing is a model almost copied from the unions. It's not, as I heard the panelist earlier talked about, what advantage is it of sitting across the table if nothing's being done, if there's no urgency? It's that conflict, it's that stress that's ultimately going to create a solution.
Listening to the president, I always had the impression that he is favoring more high tariffs to protect U.S. jobs. But probably, Stormy, you can give us your perspective on that question from a more economic point of view.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm a great fan of trade and international interconnectedness. And if you look at the data, since the end of the Second World War and the creation of the trading regime, the global one, the GATT, our countries all benefited tremendously from trade. And it raised income, prosperity, well-being, but it also created distributional effects. And that is something which we probably not sufficiently addressed over the past. So there are always winners and losers. Not everybody is competitive, and there are going to be income distributional effects of trade. And to address that, you need a good functioning also welfare system. You need buffers. You need structural policies. You need educational policies. And certainly you also need trade policies. But I would say that trade policies alone will not buffer the adjustment costs, so to say, and not make us fit for the future. So I would say we need to look at it comprehensively. If the distributional effects, the redistributional effects are caused by unfair trade abroad, and we see that very clearly, for example, by China's subsidies, overcapacities, interventions, export controls, export tariffs, then your own structural policies won't remedy this. Then you also need to pull out your trade toolbox, and there are lots of tools to use. Trade defense instruments, safeguards, anti-dumping, anti-subsidies, anti-unfair competition instruments, and so on. And the EU just designed a complete new set of them, like creating also a trade enforcement officer, anti-coercion instrument, and so on. Has that worked sufficiently in the past? No, because otherwise we probably wouldn't have seen what we are seeing currently. And I would say this is, however, what we need to look at. I would say I get it why the Trump administration is using tariffs. I get it. I, on the other hand, see the huge cost it is creating, not just internally, but also with the partners and also in terms of, I'm not so sure if you always, I mean, if you build trust with using such a hammer and how you really can get out of it. So Dan and I were deeply involved during the TTIP negotiations, and I very much regret that that wasn't done. And that would be the more preferable way. Not don't get me wrong. I'm not lobbying, advocating for revisiting of TTIP, but regulatory cooperation, getting rid of unfairnesses in tariffs, unbalances in tariffs, and looking where also we could align on our investment screening, export controls, enforcement mechanisms against countries which are really unfair in their trade policies. And then also look internally and see what needs to be done with regard to structural policies, education, training, because we are also really interested in reindustrialization, right? Or keeping the industries in Germany and in the EU. But that certainly doesn't work without skilled labor. So I think this is, as we also heard earlier, training our workforce is a really big issue.
I think you outlaid a very interesting approach to that, or probably laid-back approach to that negotiations and outcome. Roy, what is your perspective on that? As we heard, this tariffs should save jobs. Do you think they could actually backfire, especially as long as those trade negotiations go?
Yeah, no, look, I think there's a few issues, I think, at play here. First of all, we have to remember that the United States has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in generations. And so any increase in tariff rates, at least when at the end of the day, a tariff is paid by the importer. And so that importer is oftentimes a multinational company or a larger company, which already is benefiting in the United States from a very low corporate rate. And if you look at, actually, I looked up this morning, I thought it would be fun to look at. And in the first, at the end of 5 months, they've collected a little over $82 billion in tariff revenue. If you look at years past, you're at about 111 billion for a full year. So, we're on track right now of potentially doubling overall tariff revenue that the federal government in the US has collected. So this idea that, meanwhile, we've lowered our corporate rate in the United States significantly. So this idea that large multinational firms like Amazon, others, can't afford to pay a little bit more to service US consumers, because the tariff is not paid directly by the consumer. It's paid by the importer, the wholesaler. There's multiple steps along the way. And there's also these efficiency gains that are gone, that built. Walmart obviously recently got in trouble with the Chinese government for trying to seek efficiencies to reduce the burden of tariff costs. So there's a multitude of effects here. And for our members, particularly in energy-exposed, trade-exposed industries, the idea that we would try and seek a little bit more reciprocity when our membership, for example, in the steel sector, we went from 10 man-hours per ton down to less than 1 man-hour per ton in making steel, yet we're still importing over 20% of steel products from the international market. So all those efficiency gains, all those efforts to improve efficiency and improve workplace productivity did not see a growth in the steel industry in the US market, right? The idea that we are the most efficient producer, that we are this end up being a situation where we still are seeing artificially low-cost imports impact the market. And so this idea that, at least for the US, to seek a better reciprocity in trade is something that the union has long advocated for, and it's just a matter of how we approach it. And I know that the president's style is very robust in conflict, but there's also this compromise that comes at the end. Just the same as when two parties at the bargaining table, which the union has bargained contracts for over 80 years, there will be an effort to seek that compromise at the end. And that will lead to probably an adjustment. But ultimately for the union, tariffs should be a dynamic exercise. The idea that we would just magically forever put lower tariffs for no reason, when management decisions, oftentimes with firms, can make decisions to dump product into a market. And so, Vilas here knows well, there's over 700 anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases in the United States, in part because U.S. businesses have been seeing this impact of excess capacity throughout the global markets.
So I see common ground for the negotiations, that they're actually really valuable. The question is what would be a good outcome. I think there are probably some different perspectives on that panel, and maybe we can carve that out. What is your opinion? What would be in the from Berlin, Brussels perspective a good outcome, leaving aside probably the wish of a free trade agreement, which seems to be very far, right? Do you see that as well?
No, a good outcome. At the end of the day, I think it's not only about a specific tariff. Some tariffs are too high, of course. There's some sectors. I'm thinking of the car sector, for example. There's a very high tariff for 25%, and there's the question who pays this tariff. Yeah, it's of course, but this might be really lead to disturbances in the whole sector. Other sectors, other tariffs, my concern is not so much about the tariff. If there is a baseline of tariff, as we see for the 10%, for example, my concern would be more the uncertainty and the unpredictability of these tariffs. If we change these tariffs every few weeks, it's not possible for companies doing business in the transatlantic market to do the planning necessary. Well, we talked yesterday with a company, a German small, medium-sized company. They're selling a lot with the United States, and they made their contracts more than a year ago. There were no tariffs then. Of course, modern contracts have some clauses inside who has to pay for the tariffs, but the difficulties begin, of course, if these tariffs change at a weekly or monthly basis. Then they don't know exactly how to do the customs, how to do all this bureaucracy necessary, even if they don't have to pay for the tariffs. And even if they don't have to pay, we also talk to companies who have difficulties to sell their product now because it's more expensive. If you buy a car, somebody can pay it immediately. But if you have a specific machine, some tools with costs you 10 million US dollars or something, then usually the buyer doesn't pay this immediately. He needs a bank loan for this, and then the bank comes and says there's not enough leeway for you. You have to renegotiate your loan, and these are the difficulties we are facing. So to your question, if we would have a clear structure in tariffs, a different baseline perhaps, but clear structures, reliable and predictable rules, I think that would make it more easier, and I hope we land somewhere there.
So solid agreement that is not questioned all the time and remodeled. And no matter how high the tariffs are in the end, at least there's not reliable.
No, I think there's certainly a certain margin, but you may discuss it, and it depends on the different sectors. Of course, I mentioned already the car sectors. We are looking now with some concern to the 232 investigations going on for the pharmaceutical industries. We think it's a very dangerous sector if you raise tariffs from one day to another here, because there's an extremely high interdependency in the transatlantic market, but also to semiconductors or aircraft or other issues where the real trade takes place, because we have to take into account the real trade is intermediary trade. It's not trade in our supermarkets. It's trade amongst businesses, amongst industries, and amongst parts. It's a worldwide sourcing that we are interfering here, and this makes it extremely difficult to calculate how high could be a tariff. Let's say if we go for 25 or more tariff, this is really the end of some trade relations here.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, tariffs are sort of an imprecise and blunt tool for attaining certain objectives. And if your objectives are supply chain resilience, good paying jobs, manufacturing in the United States and Europe, I think the tariffs are a tool for attaining those objectives, but it's a costly tool and it's very imprecise. So if we can, my ideal situation is that we reach an arrangement that attains the objectives in a much more precisioned way than the tariffs, and that you have an arrangement that addresses the concerns of supply chain resilience, of non-market economy policies and practices, of non-tariff barriers, and you do that in lieu of the tariffs. Because the tariffs impose the costs, they impose the costs on business, they impose the costs on economic growth. So that's my ideal situation, is very precision-tailored arrangements that achieve the objectives and minimize or eliminate the need for tariffs.
Vilas, is that something also a goal for the U.S. administration? I know you don't want to speak for the U.S. administration, but for you, in your personal opinion, then that you want to achieve a reliable, what Christian mentioned, a reliable agreement that is not changed the next day or the next week, and a very precise agreement addressing certain industries.
It's difficult to speak to the outcomes so much from my position, but in terms of some of the, I think it would be helpful to, mention that that recognition of some of the underlying issues is certainly welcome in terms of what the Trump administration has highlighted. They have highlighted a growing imbalance in the trading relationship, with the bilateral trade imbalance growing. Certainly, it would be, helpful for the negotiations to recognize what both parties have to say about that. But going back to my previous answer, and this is something that Roy mentioned, it does seem like there is greater concern in the United States on both sides of the aisle about China versus the EU, and how to deal with Chinese overcapacity in key sectors, how to deal with structural imbalances. So, at the ITC, we're seeing a record caseload on petitions from domestic producers in a range of industries: steel and aluminum products, chemicals, other manufactured goods. The EU is facing many of the same challenges with products from China washing up on their shores. They're threatening to overwhelm European producers. And so in the interests of reducing that over-reliance on Chinese exports for many of the goals that have already been mentioned, supply chain resilience, climate transition as well, resilience during a crisis, we would hope that, or at least I would hope that the commonalities between both sides are emphasized in these negotiations, and therefore potential for cooperation.
But if that, let's say, sometimes difficult negotiations between the US and the EU continues, aren't we undermining the West's abilities to counterbalance China economically?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
If this difficult sometimes negotiations continue between US and EU, aren't we undermining the West's ability to counterbalance China economically?
Sure. I mean, I think that's. I think the important piece of this, though, is to emphasize the commonalities. There is a huge amount of cross-border trade and investment. The U.S. is the EU's largest destination for its exports. I believe the second largest source of imports. Great amount of cross-border investment. So I do think that those facts and those recognition of commonalities are certainly helpful to bring to the fore.
Brian, what do you think?
You're going back to the shifting of tariffs and seeking that stability, and that's important and that's critical. But what you're seeing now is with the shifting and instability that is a strategy. That is a strategy to create the urgency, and that strategy puts stresses on business. What does business do? Business contacts policymakers and saying, what are you doing to fix this? And that's where the stress needs to be. The stress, at least President Trump and his team feel it needs to be. The stress needs to be on businesses, these mid-range businesses, these large businesses, contacting their policymakers in these individual countries and saying, we need stability. What are you doing to get stability? And so it's a strategy, but it's not the end result. The end result is going to be a number. I think we know that it's going to be as low as 10%. If you look at where the U.S. is put in other places, and you look at where it's going to be with China as high as what I think 55%. So that's your range. The 10% is what it is. There's no going back. I think President Trump uses that 10% to justify the VAT, to justify non-tariff barriers in these, and that'll be ultimately where I think that lands. But I think at the end of the day, the end result is a number, is stability, it's being able to make these long-term plans. But in the transition period, in the short period, he's throwing these numbers out, frustration because it's not moving fast enough. But that instability creates tension. It creates conflict. And I'm of the opinion, I've studied unions in college, and they do it better than anybody else when it comes to conflict because they get the results. They get people to the table. They create an urgency. And you have to remember, Trump is a businessman. Who did he negotiate with most of his time? He negotiated against unions. He learned this from unions. It's a compliment to unions that he's duplicating that strategy. And by the way, it's working. And so I think at the end, we'll hit a number. The EU will hit a number. Other countries will hit a number. And you're right. And you're right here in the sense that we have to deal with China. And I think you're seeing that. President Trump's the first person to raise his hand and say, I have a problem with how China's operating. Obama was okay, Trump was okay, Clinton was okay. They ignored all these things, and Trump was the first one to say, I'm not okay with this. And that disrupted the world. And then he's the other person to say, I'm not okay with the structure with the EU, and that's disrupting the world. But at the end, we will get to a point and a number that works for everybody, but it's going to work because we're across the table negotiating, and for the first time, President Trump feels that these other countries who've been able to ignore other presidents are not ignoring him.
So you describe insecurity as a negotiation strategy from the U.S. side, right? As an effective one, as you said, that works. Stormy, do you think that's a smart strategy?
Effective.
Mean question here. Well, first of all, by all this talk about tariffs and disruptions and so on, sometimes I think we forget how interconnected we are, and that we are sometimes also shooting ourselves in the foot with what we are doing. German companies in the United States create more than 900,000 jobs. They are also in regions which are, some of them are structurally a little bit weaker than others. There's also technology transfer, massive one. For example, Aurubis set up the first recycling facility for metals and minerals, which were integrated in products. So special metals and minerals recycling. And it's the other way around as well. There are tons of US companies here which are producing here. And if we get into this tit for tat, we are applying punitive retaliatory tariffs. There are higher tariffs on the other side. And that's a really dangerous slippery slope because we are hurting our companies, we are hurting our consumers. And while it is a strategy, I just hope we get to the exit point and that we don't miss this, because if we miss it, I think it would be really problematic for both economies on both sides. And then I would also say that gets us into a really tricky situation with regard to also China and other adversaries, because we all know it's not just an economic disarray we are currently in, but we are facing like really severe security issues, a war in Europe, the escalating situation in the Middle East. So I mean, we have our hands are full with conflicts around the world. So I very much hope we find the exit strategy for this, or the exit point for this. I also would agree that we need certainty and, well, planability. And for this, this stuff needs to be also put on paper. And there needs to be a signature under it. It needs to be reliable. And what you said, that you would wish that tariffs would be a little bit more dynamic. We have those tools to be dynamic, the anti-dumping measures, the safeguard measures, the countervailing measures, the investment screening, the export controls. And for this, I think that the dialogue process of the TTC, and if we don't want to call it that anymore, but those dialogues on the specific issue areas, that is something I would love to see continued, because that would also bring us into discussions how to realign. And last point, I think people matter, trust matters, how we deal with each other, talk with each other, listen to each other, I think that matters also. And to come to a conclusion, I think it also takes goodwill and understanding. And that's a little bit what I'm worried about. I'm glad that you are here and that you are continuously doing it. I'm glad that Dan is here. But this is another thing where we need to find a way how to talk with each other continuously, to also build that trust, to then jointly address some of those really unfair trade policies in the world.
Okay, we have time for, Roy, I would like to ask you a short question and then hand over to our audience to ask questions, but probably you can, because the last point you mentioned, Stormy, I found very interesting, and I think you asked that question also, Fahimi, how to negotiate, and probably you're an expert on negotiations, so do you have one advice for peaceful negotiations?
Yeah, okay.
Effective peaceful negotiations.
Effective peaceful negotiations means, I think, between the EU and the US, and particularly Germany, of course, is coming to a realization that globalization has created a lot of uncertainty for workers. And that uncertainty for workers has led to a strong reaction on trade policy, both in Germany and in the US. And so finding solutions that are going to meaningfully lead to long-term employment for workers and ensure like good quality jobs, and that the trade rules are set in a way that doesn't export pollution. That doesn't, and when I say pollution, not just carbon, but also the ideas of like particulate matter. The U.S. has one of the lowest particulate matter PM2 standards, 2.5 standards. So the things that are finer than a human hair, and that has eliminated millions of asthma cases, millions of deaths. But that efficiency gain and those improvements, those health improvements, have not been seen the world over. China has a PM2 standard that's 3 or 4 times higher than the U.S. India has even higher rate. And the idea that our negotiations don't try and address these issues, along with labor rights at this point, are things that President Trump and the previous administration as well have tried to address. So I think if both sides come to terms related to that, to address those sorts of worker uncertainties, I think you'll see a long-term viability for any address.
Thank you for this optimistic note in the end. I would like to open the discussion to you. I see a hand over there.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. The first one is, we agree that the United States would like to have manufacturing back in the country. The question is, how coherent are the policies? Because I think Christian mentioned that. We have a lot of intermediate products. If you put tariffs on all products, if you want to invest in a company, if you want to invest in the US, you need components. You need to import these components, and if you add tariffs to that, it might not be competitive. My second question is, I still do not get over the treatment of Europe. I have to say that. We have been allies for a long time. We are treated the same way as all the other countries, including China. Our tariffs are based on national security, on a lot of sectors where we work together. So my question, especially if you want to address common challenges with regard to China, why this kind of equal treatment of Europe, where I would say that our tariffs level are sort of equal? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you introduce yourself? I forgot.
Sorry, Claudia Schmucker, head of the Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics and Technology at the German Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.
To whom do you want to ask your question?
Everyone.
Everyone. We unfortunately don't have time to let everyone.
Everyone who likes to
But
answer.
Does anyone would like to answer? Dan.
As I said, I think tariffs are an imperfect tool for achieving these objectives. So if Europe wants to encourage its manufacturing in critical industries, the United States wants to do that, we can have arrangements between ourselves that do that without tariffs. As for treatment of Europe, I think we're in a very disruptive phase where we're transitioning, I think, from one relationship to another relationship. I personally think we're transitioning to a relationship that more looks like an equal partnership than sort of a dependence relationship. And I think that's going to create some hard feelings. It's going to be disruptive. But I think ultimately we will end up in a better place in terms of the United States and the European Union being genuine strategic partners.
Thank you. I see another question over there. Could you please introduce yourself and may I ask for one question?
Moritz Sell. I'm here privately. I did start my career 35 years ago in Washington at the Export-Import Bank, so I've had a long interest in trade. Maybe a little bit in response to the previous question. I would have liked to hear something from the panel on trade diversion. And I've been looking at German trade statistics since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've seen massive trade export, like 1,000% increase in countries like Kyrgyzstan and Georgia and Armenia. Does the German government have an opinion on that? Want to hear about U.S., European, being allies? I mean, that's to me pretty shocking. And the other issues we've seen recently since the Trump tariffs, massive amounts of trade diversion, China into EU, and it looks like it's tariff arbitrage. Open comment for anyone that wants to say something about it.
Christian?
Well, trade diversion is a very valid point. We are also concerned about trade diversion and or very preoccupied what will happen. Unfortunately, we don't have any reliable figures now. We are discussing this in Brussels with the European Commission because they have the overview of the all internal market. And these figures are not reliable now because there are seasonal effects in this. There's one side, the big effect that people seeing tariffs coming bought a lot already. So there's a lot of import, much more import into in the transatlantic field into the US than was before. This is one thing we noticed. And then we have the situation that certain goods are, especially the agricultural goods, are seasoned and so on. So it's not reliable still now, but it will be reliable in a couple of weeks. So we're waiting for this trade figures. What of course is important is the time frame. Again, with the uncertainty, people are waiting what to do. If this continues to be an uncertain situation for several months, perhaps for years, or with high tariffs, then we will see diversion for sure. So our economists make a difference between short diversion of trade and in the long term. In the long term, we will see, and we will need to protect ourselves against overcapacities and other things.
May I jump in that question
Sure.
as well? Yeah.
Yes.
Last time around during the first Trump administration, there were also trade diverting effects with regard to the steel imports, steel and aluminum. So the EU decided to implement safeguards, and I mean that is the reaction to it. And that is always really hard to decide then how to really do it, because then we are also hurting our producers down the value chain because products are getting more expensive. So you always need to find a fine line between protecting then your own market, but also at the same time not hurting your own producers. And I think there's a second dimension this time around. I mean, it would pertain a lot more products than last time. And we are, as EU, currently negotiating with quite a few interesting trading partners. So we need to take into account also how those safeguards will then impact those possible safeguards could impact negotiations with these trading partners. Claudia's question with regard to treatment of the EU, I would love to hear Brian's opinion also on this, because yesterday I asked you, does the Trump administration like us? And I don't know if we could. I mean, it would be really interesting.
Listen. I said it yesterday, and I've said it, throughout the world, and President Trump has said it, because they asked the question, "Does Trump hate China?" Yeah, I think he admires the Chinese with one respect, and he certainly admires the Germans with another respect. You guys have negotiated great circumstances for your country for a very long time, and President Trump would say to the disadvantage of the Americans. And our policymakers ignored those stresses that existed. And if anything, he admires how much your politicians had advocated for your companies, had advocated for your people, clearly to what he views to the detriment of the American worker. And I think he looks at it. He certainly said that, and he thinks our policymakers have done a disservice to the American people. So I think you should look at it as a way of, he likes what you guys have done. He wants to emulate what you've done, but he wants to do it for the American workers, and that shouldn't create a stress for anybody. Your leaders are in charge of the leadership for your country, of advocating for your people. President Trump's the leader of the United States, and his job is to advocate for the American worker. His job is to say, our previous leaders, and he said it before, had done a tremendous disservice. I think the word he'd used is, he goes, these American negotiators, and no disrespect to people who are on the stage, have gotten their asses kicked when it comes to negotiating against big countries, against other EUs. And that shouldn't exist. And what he's doing now is he's putting his foot in the sand and saying, you guys have done a great job. I admire what you've done, but I'm not going to copy what you guys have done and prioritize your work and prioritize our workers like you've prioritized yours. And that shouldn't create stress. That's just, the best compliment is to copy what somebody else is doing. We're copying what the Chinese have done, and we're clearly trying to copy what the Germans have done.
So it's a compliment.
Compliment.
I said on the trade diversion issue, the United States does need to take action against China and some other countries that will have a negative effect on Europe, which I think reinforces the need to work with Europe collectively to find some way jointly of pushing back against these practices. And I think that is a big focus of some of where the discussion should be in any case, how we jointly address supply chain vulnerability, how we jointly address non-market economy excess capacity, how we jointly address some of these non-market policies and practices. I think we need to work together. Otherwise, you end up in the situation where, as Storeen pointed out, the EU needs to put in safeguards which don't really work quite as well as they should. We should have an arrangement like the US and the EU tried to do in steel and aluminum, where you facilitate trade in market economy, sustainable steel, and you disincentivize the trade, other kinds of trade. That we should be working on together.
Thank you. So I see some more questions, and I would ask you to bring a very short question and to whom you want to ask it, because we're running out of time. So both of you.
So my name is Esteban Blanchard. I am the head of media of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy that you know my boss, Mark. Very direct. Would you put, because I have to make it short, would you put your hand on the fire that, for example, with the situation right now, China is not taking over Taiwan between now and 2035, that will blow up the transatlantic relations related to the topic of the AI, semiconductors and everything, because we rely so much on China, on Taiwan to producing this. And if it's happening, how will it affect these transatlantic relations? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to whom do you want to ask your questions?
You? I'm not answering the question.
No, to whom on the panel do you want to ask your question?
Whoever has the value or feels confident.
Who feels confident?
China, Taiwan.
Everyone.
I think the most important piece here is the long-term negotiation between the EU and the US will lead to, hopefully, policy solutions that will hopefully de-escalate tensions in China, so that we don't see President Xi make a super strategic blunder and invade what the U.S. considers the president is often considered a key ally, and that is Taiwan. So I'm a unionist. I don't normally work on a lot of international foreign policy to that effect, but these trade tensions can lead to solutions, and these solutions will hopefully then lead to more strategic discussions towards these sorts of global foreign policy concerns.
Let me add to that really quick. The U.S. assessment during Trump's first term was that China never needed to invade Taiwan, that it would take it over economically in 20 years. And if you talk to Chinese people, if you speak to the Chinese government, they said the same thing. They're like, we don't understand where this stress is coming from that we're going to invade Taiwan. He goes, economically, we can take it over, what we're doing in 20 years. How many embassies have been shut down all over the world? Taiwanese embassies have been shut down all over the world as a direct result of China's ask. I think this new tension that's come up, that this invasion is going to take place or it's anticipated, it's a new one. I'm suspicious of it. I come from the point that I'm always suspicious, of military conflict, especially when the U.S. is advocating it. And you had our policymakers who are like, we have to come in and defend and do all these things. The reality is if we do nothing with China, or if we do nothing with Taiwan, I should say, China will eat up Taiwan in 20 years economically, and they don't have to fire a single bullet. And I think that's important to realize. There doesn't have to be a military conflict there. They already have the plan that's a non-military conflict, and that's for those policymakers to resolve. It's not for us to get involved in. Economy's getting eaten up all the time.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, or are we running out of time? Yes, I see a yes. So the last question.
Okay, all right. Good morning. Thank you. My name is Sean Witry. I'm a senior project manager at the Transatlantic Business and Investment Council. My question goes out to any of the Americans on the panel as a fellow American. What I want to know is, what do you honestly think the tariffs are actually hoping to achieve? Because there seems to be a lot of purported helping the American worker, helping bringing jobs back, but according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there's already 500,000 manufacturing jobs that are unfilled in the United States. Supply chains and the workforce in the U.S. are either unavailable or not viable. Investments into the U.S., if we look at unions, typically go to right-to-work states. If we look at unions, particularly the recent acquisition of U.S. Steel by Nippon Steel, a $14 billion acquisition, was campaigned against by both Biden and Trump, and recently went through last week. So if we even bring steel back to the U.S., these investments, people talk, oh, this is an amazing investment to the U.S., is likely to increase coal production, increase use of coal, which is likely to lead to another health outcome. So it seems that there's a big gap between what the policies say they want to do and the effects that they're actually having for the American workforce. So,
yeah, I mean, look, the union had a strong position on the acquisition of Nippon and U.S. Steel, but we are at a point now that transaction's concluded, and so our most important fact is the negotiations next year. So we have, 12,000 members at U.S. Steel, and our concern through the entire transaction was the ability to bargain a fair agreement. The president has made a decision and now has a golden share and has made a strategic decision through a mitigation process, the CFIUS. And that will lead to, hopefully, no reductions in workforce. And for an industry like the U.S. industry, where we've seen excess capacity in the global marketplace related to steel impact the employment of tens of thousands of United Steelworkers jobs, we are looking forward to trying to build policies, both in the US and working with our European colleagues to address that. You look forward, we talk about China today, but there's 135 million tons of new capacity coming online in Southeast Asia alone. India is rapidly expanding its steel capacity related to its overall production. And typically, as a country modernizes, they have an arc. And as that arc of steel consumption peaks, it then starts to go down, right? And as it starts to go down, there's this massive excess hang. And if India overproduces their steel on the front end, we will see long-term impacts of steel capacity in the long term. So we're going to have a situation where there's going to need to be a mitigation to either, why should US workers be the ones that get laid off first when India has a steel overhang or China has a steel overhang? So these are strategic competition issues. And same with European. Euro 4 was very much for a negotiated deal in the 232s between the US and the EU. And unfortunately, it felt like DG Trade was more concerned about mixity issues on labor rights than it was about getting a deal. All respect to DG Trade. So I think that there's some opportunities here to like build forward strategies that recognize Western democracies as places of vibrance, of innovation, of manufacturing prowess. But in order to do so, you need tools, such as trade enforcement tools, to ensure that we don't allow non-market excess capacity to wipe out good paying jobs both in Europe and in the US.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you for your questions. I'm sure you could all answer to that, but probably we can continue our conversation at the coffee break, which is now, and I'm the last thing before that coffee break. So thank you so much for listening. It was thank you so much for your insights and your expertise. It was very interesting for me, and I hope for you as well. So enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. And don't run away. We will do a group picture up on stage.